You are the author of 6 different books, and you have also written extensively on democracy, extremism, human rights, and Kurds. In late March this year, Joakim was arrested in Istanbul while entering Turkey to cover mass protests sparked by the detention of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. And after being held in custody in 7 weeks in Turkey, you were freed in the middle of May and allowed to return home, even though you did receive an 11-month suspended sentence for insulting the president. And this September, a second judicial process will start, where the Turkish authorities are accusing you of terrorism. We're going to start by giving Joakim the floor for a first presentation around 40 minutes. And after that, we will have a conversation with other distinguished guests. And we will, of course, also leave room and time for questions from the public. But welcome very much, Joakim, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to come here to talk about this topic, which is obviously a very personally important topic for me, but the way I see it as, and also the way other journalists and other people see it, this is a crucial topic and question for when it comes to press freedom and how powerful forces at play are trying to work against press freedom and the profession that we as journalists have. This is a drawing because of the lack of photos of me and the environment that I spent 51 days in captivity in Turkey. The newspaper where I work, Dagens ETC, they contracted an illustrator, a brilliant Englishman by the name of Graham, who interviewed me for hours and hours about the tiniest little detail regarding how things looked in my cell. An 18 square meter big cell where I kept 51 days in social confinement. I was not allowed to leave it, apart from basically once a week when my lawyers came and my general consul came from the Swedish consulate of Istanbul. So he managed to capture actually every detail color-wise, the furniture, even the pictures of my wife, my pregnant wife that I had smuggled into my cell and kept on the wall. This is also an overlook of the cell where I spent all of these days. So it looks kind of, people have compared it, and I even have compared it myself to living in a student room if you live in a corridor. And I suppose it reminds a little bit about that. You have your own bathroom and a tiny little kitchen area. But the main difference is that you're not allowed to leave it. You have to spend your entire time there. Also, there's no such thing as internet and getting access to a lot of independent information. And also, there's no way of interacting with people apart from shouting to them to about a centimeter wide crack between the door and the floor. And I also got 10 minutes per week, not more, when I was allowed to make a phone call to my wife to keep myself updated a little bit about campaigning in Sweden and abroad, where people were sharing the news and the messages about me and my situation and my captivity. And denouncing, obviously, the accusations that I was a president insulter and a terrorist. Instead, I'm a journalist. This situation came as sort of a surprise because I am a foreign affairs journalist, reporter, and my experience is that this is a kind of a bitter situation to be in most of the time, because you never ever feel that my news are actually the biggest news. More than often, I feel that people never pay enough attention to the things that I report about. My articles are never ever the most clicked one on the newspaper site where I work. So I was I was very shocked to find out that the Turkish government actually knew who I was. I simply assume that my reporting, also being in a small language, the Swedish language, went completely unnoticed in an international context. And it turned out that that wasn't the case. So what is that going to tell us in that case about the dangers that also journalists writing from your own country, in your own language, not in English, and also on a site behind paywall, the kind of dangers that we are facing at the moment, if a thing like this can happen. I want to give you a short background. So my name is, again, Joakim Medin. I started my career as journalist in the city of Tegucigalpa in the country of Honduras in Central America in June 2009, when there was a military coup against the democratically elected liberal president Manuel Zelaya, who tried to make a referendum to reform the constitution in a more democratic direction. Instead, there was a military coup. So I was contracted by an American journalist to be his photographer and also to make interviews in Spanish, which I spoke, to help him out to write the articles. And this is my first experience of journalism, and it immediately made me interested in foreign affairs journalism, in geopolitics, and also in writing about democracy topics, human rights, and so on and so on. And I've basically stuck to that ever since. This has always been my main field of journalism, even though I've written about many other things as well. After this experience, I've spent years abroad. I lived a few summers on the West Bank, reporting about human rights crimes. I lived in Beirut in the summer of 2013, writing about the growing Syrian refugee crisis before it actually became a bigger topic in a European context. And then 2014, when the Islamic State group committed genocide against the Yazidi minority in northern Iraq, I went into Syria because the survivors of this genocide escaped the border into northeastern Syria. And I followed them there to meet them as they approached the border and crossed it, reporting about this terrible incident. And seeing the survivors scream for food and water after spending almost a week in this semi-desert area of northern Iraq. And I also saw the people who saved them. This, until that point, kind of unknown Kurdish group YPG and their female branch YPJ, who made this very rare to be a non-state actor. They made a cross-border rescue operation to save these tens of thousands of Yazidis. If you remember this, they were stuck on a mountain, Mount Sinjar, where they were facing a slow death due to dehydration and starvation because they were surrounded by Islamic State fighters. So these kind of unknown Kurds made this cross-border rescue operation and saved all of them. And this made them basically international superstars because they acted when no one else could or wanted in that situation. And the Kurds, with their very media-friendly female fighters, became basically a beacon of hope in this terrible, very tragic and hopeless situation in the Middle East, fighting against the Islamic State group. And this made me intrigued because they seemingly, if you at least studied most Western media outlets, seemingly came out of nowhere and became so popular and superstars, and the main allies of the US-led coalition against the Islamic State. And they remained so until the Islamic State were defeated in combat in March 2019, when they again passed into obscurity. Because then, less than a year later, we had the coronavirus pandemic, and then we had Ukraine, and then we had other world news. And the Kurds and Syria in general just became not at all a very popular topic anymore to report about. But I and some other journalists stuck to this country because it's interesting to keep following geopolitical topics, especially when most of the mainstream media looks at something else. And I kept writing about geopolitics, about how every NATO country kept the Kurds as allies, except for the NATO member Turkey being on the opposite side of the political spectra. And I wrote such articles as this about how the Turkish Air Force and drones were raining bombs over Kurdish positions in Syria, to a level that even the American Air Force started shooting down Turkish drones, which was a very rare interaction between two NATO member states. Then, in 2022, of course, after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I experienced firsthand because I was I was in Kyiv on the 24th of February 2022 when the Russians invaded. It was more or less, I was deliberately sent there, obviously, to report from my newspaper about that there is a high probability that there's going to be some conflict happening here, a larger conflict, so to say. But it was circumstantial, apart from that I happened to be there on that date. So I've always said and written that I understand that this Russian invasion created angst and fear and worrying and a completely new situation in most ways, which boosted, at least temporarily, boosted massively the Swedish popular, the popular Swedish support for joining NATO. Then it declined again. But it boosted temporarily this idea of that we have to be a part of NATO. And this is something that every NATO member state happily saw and accepted and welcomed Sweden into the NATO family. And this happened, as you all know, simultaneously as Finland also pushed forward towards joining NATO. The only member state which together with Hungary, of course, when it comes to Sweden, which changed their mind all of a sudden was Turkey. On Friday the 13th, 2022, the unlucky date, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced from nowhere that he had changed his mind and that Sweden and Finland was not welcome in NATO. Because Sweden and Finland, and especially Sweden, was seen as a safe haven for terrorists in exile. Turkish citizens, but as we understand it also other people, not Turkish citizens, that the Turkish state and government considers terrorists, had found a safe haven, a harbor for their activities in Sweden. And this is something that the Turkish government was very much against and wanted to fight against. So he announced this after attending the Friday prayer on 13th May 2022 and immediately started pushing demands. At the same time, the Turkish state-controlled media landscape, the Turkish government controls about 80% of all media outlets in Turkey. It's one of the most low-ranking countries in the world when it comes to press freedom. They started immediately this smear campaign against Sweden and Finland, but mostly against Sweden, having a larger, much larger Kurdish diaspora, being very politically active in Sweden. The Turkish government and their media outlets, the Turkish media outlets being loyal to the Turkish government, as well as representatives of the Turkish government, started publishing these photos and names and lists of people that they demanded to have sent to Kurdish prisons, Turkish prisons. And these were mostly Kurdish political refugees that the Turkish government has linked to the outlawed PKK group, and other people that the Turkish government have linked to the only in Turkey outlawed Gülen movement, having been accused of instigating the 2016 attempted coup d'etat against Erdogan, even though the evidence is, we haven't really seen any great evidence for this yet. The biggest number, if I remember correctly, was either 130 or 175 individuals that Turkey demanded to have sent to a waiting prison cell from Sweden. The number kept changing constantly, even in the formal rhetorics of President Erdogan. He never decided on a specific number. He kept updating the number. Sometimes it was bigger, sometimes it was smaller. While the spokesperson of the Turkish government, Ibrahim Kalin, he also said that it's perfectly clear what needs to be done. They have to stop allowing PKK outlets and PKK activities, PKK organizations, PKK individuals and other types of presence to exist in those countries. Finland and Sweden, but especially in Sweden, which was the main target of this campaign. And in most ears, this sounded like a new thing, these demands, that we have to shut down organizations, stop protests, ban individuals, or stop individuals from having political ideas and to freely express them. This sounded like a new idea, but it wasn't. Almost all of these demands had already been formulated in a big report which came in 2019. This is a report published by the biggest think tank in Turkey. It's called SETA, and it's 100% linked to the Turkish government. When this report, which claimed to map the PKK network in Europe, when it was published in 2019, this think tank was run by the son-in-law of President Erdogan himself. So this is like a family organization, and the government, a so-called GONGO, government-organized non-governmental organization. Also well known from Hungary, for example. So this report it was 666 pages long. It consisted of several different chapters, and every chapter was one country. And in the Swedish chapter, they identified a lot of different Swedish Kurdish organizations, as well as the Swedish Minister of Defense, the Social Democrat Peter Hultqvist, the then leader of the Swedish Left Party, Jonas Sjöstedt, and many other 100% Swedish politicians as being secret PKK terrorists. They didn't identify or claim or accuse any journalists in a Swedish context of being terrorists. But this was seemingly mapped nevertheless. Apart from all of these things, you might have followed the reporting which showed that the Turkish government grasped at any opportunity to criticize the Swedish government or something happening in Sweden to be a reason to not allow Sweden to become a member of NATO. It was the issue of this crazy Danish-Swedish guy burning the Quran. And this also became a formal demand that you have to ban Quran burning. Only after that can we allow you to join NATO. They also tried to ban the public service television from interviewing Kurdish politicians. Only after that can you join NATO. The issue of the Erdogan doll, which two activists hung upside down in his shoes in front of the city hall in Stockholm on the 13th of January 2023, also became a hot topic. Erdogan was obviously very upset by this, but they also grasped the opportunity to become so. So the Turkish government formally accused these activists behind this. It's a very tiny activist group behind this. They accused them of being terrorists, and they demanded that the Swedish government also label them as terrorists and start a judicial process against them. And this wasn't possible because this is freedom of speech. So nothing happened. Eventually, as you all know, also in this country, there was a very famous/infamous NATO summit in Madrid in late June 2022, when the delegations from Helsinki and Stockholm met with the Turkish counterpart and agreed to give in to some of these demands, at least. Finland and Sweden officially wrote a memorandum with the Turkish delegation saying that we completely stand behind the Turkish fight against terrorism, and we are to join forces basically in the struggle against terrorism. It was a bleak but still politically important statement coming from these three delegations together. This also made people who had believed in the Swedish Social Democrats quite upset, because they backtracked on several quite important topics in this agreement with Turkey. Finland joined NATO. Sweden still stayed outside NATO. Eventually, there was a second memorandum with the Turkish government, resulting in a new press statement, a new handshake between the tiny Ulf Kristersson and the enormous Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Again, he managed to crush his hand on several photos. Eventually this led to, in early 2024, that Sweden was allowed to join NATO. Now, if you have a look at the official page at the Swedish government about the history of Sweden and NATO, it sounds like this is a massive web page. It's not. It basically consists of that piece and that. A few dates. And seemingly this was a very, very pain-free, very easy process. It just took some time. And nothing controversial happened at all. And those of us in the Swedish media landscape who investigated this found that quite a lot of things actually did happen. And most of them happened in a clandestine way. Things were done, things were promised, things have happened after Sweden joined NATO because of agreements, non-public agreements, secret agreements with the Turkish counterpart. We did find out publicly that in late September 2022, Sweden resumed the arms exports to Turkey, which Sweden had stopped 3 years earlier because of the illegal Turkish invasion of Syria into the areas controlled by the NATO-allied Kurdish forces in northeastern Syria. This was condemned by all other NATO countries, as well as the entire US-led coalition, as well as most meaningful voices in the European Union. And Sweden and several other key countries in the European Union stopped their arms exports to Turkey because of this. Now it resumed because Turkey demanded so of Sweden. The Dagens Nyheter newspaper in Stockholm also managed to find a secret list of promises made to Turkey and things that Sweden actually had done behind closed doors to please the Turkish counterpart. For example, making sure that a lot more Kurdish asylum seekers seeking asylum because of political reasons from Turkey would be denied asylum. Because Turkey claims that most Kurds coming to Sweden are terrorists. And this seemingly has also happened. People have been denied asylum, have been denied work permits, have been denied Swedish citizenship, even though they've stayed for years in Sweden, because of this new policy appearing. We also had an infamous deportation in December 2022 of two Kurdish asylum seekers. Only one of them is known in media, because the other one walked free. Mr. Mahmoud Tat, who was not extradited, as he said here, he was deported to Sweden when he was denied asylum and deported to Turkey. And this happened in the very same moment when Turkey demanded to have people sent to their cells. In this moment, in early December 2022, the Swedish government stated that there is no connection at all to these Turkish demands between this deportation and their demands. Just 3 weeks later, when our then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Tobias Billström, was in Ankara to meet the government there, and he participated in an interview with the state news bureau, Anadolu Ajansi. He said that this deportation was done because he requested us to speed up the war against terror, the fight against terror in Sweden. So now he actually admitted this on a recorded interview with the state news bureau. These things and many, many more investigations and so on, which I also did and wrote about, was collected in my latest book, KURDS, Sweden, Turkey, and the Prize for NATO membership. KURDS means basically the Kurdish track, and this is connected to the PKK track, which the Swedish intelligence falsely followed to explain the murder of our Prime Minister Olof Palme in 1986, when the Kurds were accused for years of having assassinated our Prime Minister, and this turned out to be not true. But they were blamed for this for years. And many Kurds have made this connection that now it happened again. We were accused, we were made like the scapegoats, the reason why we couldn't join the safety in NATO. We, the Kurds, were the issues again. I'm not Kurdish at all, so I don't know what this feeling feels like, but apparently this made a lot of people of Kurdish heritage quite upset and disappointed, these rhetorics happening during the NATO process. Now, I returned to go back to what we heard when I first entered the stage here. I went to Turkey for my 21st visit in late March this year because of the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul, Mr. Ekrem İmamoğlu. He is from the biggest opposition party in the country, the Social Democratic CHP. And he is seen as the main political rival of President Erdogan. He was 2 days after being arrested, formally elected as the presidential candidate in the next election. He was therefore obviously arrested. He's been linked to corruption and terrorism, as so many others, as hundreds of thousands of other people having been swept up in these mass arrests, whether they be journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers, intellectuals, writers, publishers, opposition politicians, etc. So I went there to report about this and the fact that there were mass protests against the government, and the government accused the protesters of being street terrorists. And I was detained at the airport on 27th March 2025. 2 days later, I was declared formally arrested, accused of being a terrorist and of having insulted the president. And I was sent to the world's biggest prison, Marmara, and specifically to the Department of Political Prisoners. The first thing that happened to me when I came there 2 days after being detained, which I spent in a police station and then in another prison, was that I made eye contact with another prisoner in the yard in front of me, and he showed me this newspaper, and it's a nationalist, like brown red nationalist newspaper, formerly like super socialist, but pro-Putin, kind of pro-governmental brown red nationalist newspaper, Aydınlık. And they had this propaganda piece where they interviewed the far-right activist, so-called journalist, former Nazi Christian Petersson, who is a well-known far-right activist in Sweden, mapping people he don't like and following people he don't like. And he was a source in this interview where he said that I am a terrorist. And this was printed in this newspaper and distributed and published all over the country. And this made me terrified because this was the first news that I got from Sweden, and I was terrified because I thought that this was the main narrative back home. People are actually thinking there's some truth to this, because in prison, being in this situation, it will play tricks with your head. At least it did with me, and I was terrified and had ideas that wasn't obviously necessarily true. I also saw this picture because on the front page of my latest book, KURDS, as you see, there is a man standing between two Turkish flags. He is also a Kurdish asylum seeker who was deported already in 2020. So he was the first one, then you had this one in December 2022. And this neighbor in front of me, he said, hey, my name is Adnan, there's a guy here that you know. And then he shouted, Resul, over the wall. And the other guy responded, and it was him on the front side of my book. And then they said, there's another guy that you know here, Mahmoud. And then the other guy from December 22 responded, Evert, yes. So by coincidence, this absurd coincidence, or maybe not, I don't know, I ended up in the same corridor being a neighbor of these two guys that I wrote about in several articles and in my latest book, of people who were deported to Turkish prisons, being asylum seekers and who were denied this. Now, being in this situation, and I'm going to eventually round up here, my photo was taken by a photographer earlier today, and he asked me, it must have been terrible to be in this situation, to be in social confinement for 51 days. You're not allowed to leave this tiny little space. You have no idea when you're going to get home, if you're going to get home, because there's really no justice in this so-called justice system in Turkey. It's a politicized system, and there's many other cases of Turkish and Kurdish journalists having been arrested and formally accused of the same things, and they remain for years in this situation. So I was, yes, because having this knowledge, I was terrified, obviously. But I told him, this photographer, that yeah, but the thing was that I never allowed myself, I never stopped being a journalist. I didn't allow myself to stop being a journalist. So I immediately started interviewing my neighbors, shouting through them under the door. I took notes with a pen that this a guy who was deported in 2022 threw to me over the wall. So I wrote about what I experienced from the very first day when I had access to a pencil. And it was a very interesting time in that sense, seeing the inside of this vast prison facility, prison universe as we have it in Turkey, where there's over 400,000 people in prison. I met people representing basically every single political entity having been in one way or the other attacked and imprisoned by the government in the last dozen years. Soldiers who were swept up and accused for some reason or no reason, accused of being linked to the coup attempt of 2016. Two of my neighbors were former NATO officers. They spoke fluent and really great English. That's why I could communicate with them. There were Kurds in this prison, also having swept up in the last decade or so. The world-famous Turkish author Ahmet Altan, who were really one of the most famous prisoners a few years ago in the same prison, Marmara prison, he sent me a personal letter where he told me to keep fighting and never give up. And I made contact with the world-famous political prisoner Osman Kavala, who is a prisoner of conscience with Amnesty International since years. He's been there for 8 years now, and the European Court they've demanded that he must be released because there's not a single piece of evidence that he is allegedly a terrorist, but he simply remains there. What happens now? So on 30th of April, I had my first trial where I was accused of having insulted the president. And they based this basically on 2 articles that I wrote with pictures. One was this article with this picture where I wrote that the Swedish government in March 2023, they announced a new law, a new harsher law against terrorism. And this was already in the works, but they presented this of coming into place because of the Turkish demands during the NATO process. So I wrote about this, and this targeted Kurdish protests. So I interviewed the biggest Kurdish organization, and they said we're going to keep protesting anyway. And there was a photo that I had taken earlier in the winter of this infamous Erdogan doll. The same doll also appeared in a second article I wrote, where it appeared in Stockholm Pride, waving an LGBTI flag, the rainbow flag. And this is, according to my lawyers, the first case in Turkish history where they bring a case that connecting the Turkish president with the rainbow flag is a case of insulting the president. Apparently, according to my lawyers, this is the first time this happens. So I was formally sentenced to 11 months and 20 days in prison for insulting the president because of the LGBTI flag and this former article. This is a suspended sentence, which means that because I haven't got a record since before, I don't necessarily have to serve it. So 17 days after this, I was released and allowed to return to Sweden because I was deported. There's many reasons to why this could happen, probably. One thing is that there was some pressure coming from the Swedish government, obviously. There was a lot of pressure coming from Swedish and international media outlets and press freedom organizations. We also have the peace process going on in Turkey between the Kurdish movement, PKK, and the Turkish government, which has resulted in during this spring, the end of the armed conflict, which has been going on since 1984. The PKK, which is listed as a terrorist organization by the EU, they have formally announced the end of the armed campaign. They've started giving up their weapons and have announced that they are dissolving as an organization. And the same day I was released from prison, a lot of other Kurdish political prisoners accused of being also terrible terrorists were released the same day, because these are political cases. They kept there for political reasons, not necessarily because they are terrorists. Now the question remains, will this process lead to the cases against me being dropped or not? In 1 month, on September 25, there's my second trial will start. This is the second more serious trial, we can say. I am accused of being a terrorist. I'm accused of being a member of the PKK and of disseminating terrorist propaganda, like many other journalists, authors, or just people sharing their opinions in social media before me have been accused of and sentenced for. But can I be sentenced for belonging to an organization no longer existing? I'm not sure. No one knows, because Turkey is a very unpredictable country. So we don't know what's going to happen. My lawyers have really no updates for me so far, because they have no idea what's going to happen. Questions remain over the Swedish journalist released from Turkey, also after I came home. The Swedish radio have reported how only 5 or 6 days before I was released from prison, there was a very highlighted, there were 2 cases where a diplomat belonging to the Department of Foreign Affairs in Sweden and a very high-ranking Kurdish official were arrested in Sweden. The Swedish radio, the public service media, as well as other media outlets, have speculated, even saying out loud that this is connected, this double arrest as it says here in Sweden, that this is connected to me. That the Swedish intelligence arrested this diplomat and this high-ranking Kurdish official as a favor to the Turkish side, and then I was released. The Swedish government has said, no, no, no, that's completely absurd. But other people have said that it happened too close in time to be not connected. Finally, I wonder what's going to happen next. I have publicly said when lecturing about this, when attending panel talks about this, when being interviewed about this is again in Swedish, sorry for those of you who can't read it, but I have said publicly that the case against me, in this case against me, I am one of 15 Swedish citizens being listed as terrorists by Turkey. In the case against me, I have seen the documentation. They are listing 15 Swedish individuals as terrorists. I'm just one of these 15. I'm the first one of these 15 having traveled to Turkey and ended up in prison. Almost half of us are journalists and authors. And the thing in common is that we've been reporting from a critical point of view about the authoritarian push in Turkey and their foreign affairs, especially involving Kurds. I have not heard a single comment so far from any Swedish authorities or representatives of our government about this. Neither have I been contacted by anyone from our government since returning home. And I'm thinking it's been summertime, that's fair, but if nothing has still happened in 1 month's time when the next trial begins, I wonder what that's going to mean in that case. Finally, this next trial could also result in, if the judge finds that there's no excuse for me not attending the trial, despite of me having been deported from Turkey and having a travel ban going back. If the judge finds that there's no excuse for me not attending physically the second trial, my lawyers have said that there's a high risk that I will be declared internationally wanted via Interpol. Thus, it's going to be very unsafe for me to travel what my lawyers call the democratic world, which is a very, a shrinking part of the world. There's basically about 25 liberal democracies left in the world. We already have cases such as this from 2017, where a Swedish-Turkish journalist and writer was arrested in Barcelona because he was declared a terrorist and he was wanted by Interpol, via Interpol by Turkey. And I don't want this to happen to me if I go to Spain, which I plan to do, obviously. Thank you, and let's take it from here in the panel talk.
Thank you. What an introduction. I want to welcome our other participants. Once they, me and Lee, we're going to. So, with us on stage, we have Kaius Niemi, former editor-in-chief of Helsingin Sanomat and chairperson of the Finnish Reporters Without Borders. Then Anastasia Kallius, a researcher who has written a lot on democracy and the far right, especially in the case of Hungary. I will move to this side. First off, what an introduction, first off. Bit at loss of words on Joakim's story. Would you care to share any reflections on our introduction? Maybe Anastasia first.
Absolutely. Is this on? Yeah, sure. Great. Thank you, Joakim, so much. And I'll just share a quick reflection and then a few questions for you about it. So first of all, thanks for bringing us back in your introduction to this era of the 2010s and the whole story of ISIS and all of that, because I feel like a lot of the shrinking of the democratic world, as you put it, is something that started then, or we started noticing it back then. And then to the 2020s, this whole story of NATO was, of course, very much followed here, but obviously more from a Finnish perspective. So it was very good to hear exactly how problematic that was like in Sweden. So thank you very much. And I have two observations, both of which have include a question for you, if you want to answer after Kaius's reflections as well. So one thing was, I was struck by the multitude of ways in which authoritarian governments and regimes manage to influence the democratic world, both by outright spying of citizens and refugee activist work in these countries, but also through these diplomatic back deals that we actually don't know much about. So my question to you would be, this might be a bit difficult, but what should and could be done about it? So those of us who care about democracy and how it's being encroached like this. And the second question is, very much in the beginning you said that your stories don't get any clicks. Well, not any clicks, but that these are not the things that people are most interested in. And I was very struck by this. So why? What do you think? Why don't people want to read about the entrenchment of authoritarianism? And on the other hand, also, why should they read stories like yours? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Very, very interesting and important lecture, so to say, about what's really happening. I'm representing the RSF, the Reporters Without Borders, and one of the key aspects of the organization is to provide on a yearly basis a World Press Freedom Index, which is actually one of the largest ways of looking at the trends of what's really happening. And the striking thing actually in that is that, like, we are on the so-called green zone here in Finland, in Sweden, in Estonia, in Holland, in Norway, and so forth, which is only which is considered to be, like, press freedom is considered to be good. And it's only 0.8% of the whole global population. And if you look at it from the map, you might see a lot of green, but that's because Greenland is part of Denmark. So it's like it's really crazy, and so that's why I think it's very, very important that we are not feeling ourselves completely intact of the problems which we are facing. And Joakim's story, I mean, your story is very powerful because it really tells in a concrete way that also our societies, our ways of dealing with journalism, and it's been part of this nasty game which we are seeing all around the world, and seeing it in the index, for instance, that the situation is worse than ever before, like within these several decades that the index has been, and there's several reasons for that. We can go a little bit deeper, but I think you concretized really, really well. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Do you want to respond? I can. So let's start with the questions. So I mean, difficult question. The first one, what could be done? I suppose the democratic part of the world, with its elected politicians and so on, the governmental side must recognize the threats for what they are. Must recognize the general trend we see in the world, where democracy is being pushed back, and not allow itself to be influenced or be taken even a hostage of the agenda. It's most of us saw clearly from the very beginning that there was an authoritarian agenda in the Turkish demands on Sweden, keeping us sidelined for so long, and having these clearly authoritarian goals, which what they demanded. And I could go on and on about what I wrote about in my last book, in articles, that this has resulted in Turkey, for example, have been demanding that Sweden close down this Kurdish exile television station broadcasting from a suburb in Stockholm. It's called Aryan News. They report mainly about Iran and Turkey and so on. And several of these journalists, at least 6 that I know of, have had residency permits denied and revoked. And several of them have been deported. One is due to be deported to Syria with her husband and 6-year-old son. So this is like half the staff of this television station. And this comes after Turkey demanded that Sweden close it. So I wonder if the Swedish authorities realize how bad this actually looks, especially from the outside, obviously. So not to give in to these demands, obviously, which would be the first step. And to understand that if we only represent 0.8%, we have to really guard what we have. The second question, again, what was it? Sorry.
Why should people read about the entrenchments of authoritarianism?
Right.
Across the world, specifically.
Or international news in general.
Exactly. Why should people read international news?
Yeah, I mean, I think people should, but I don't think this is interesting enough.
Why?
I wanted the same thing, because this is what I mainly do. But my colleagues working for the Swedish television, Swedish radio, commercial media outlets will tell me the same thing. They are never ever among the top journalists delivering the pieces that most people read or watch or listen to. It's just the way things are, at least in a Swedish context. Generally speaking, international news is not very sexy. So people want to read about Swedish news. There's always the shortcut if there's a Swedish link somehow. It might be interesting reading about international news, but generally reading about another country became a dictatorship, it's not very interesting. It's perhaps even depressing. So people sheer away from it.
I would like to hear Kaius's comment on this, because you have a lot of experience from this, both as a former war correspondent and then, of course, the editor-in-chief of one of the largest newspapers around here. So, what are your reflections on? Do you agree, and why is it the case?
I kind of agree, but I want to disagree in the sense that, like, I think it's really upon on the journalism and their access about, like, you know, how interesting things are. And I've always resisted the idea, even though it might be statistically a little bit, like, you know, biased, that we should do journalism that is, you know, immersive and being, you know, on the spot as you have been, so that you can actually report. Because most of the foreign reporting is very bulkish, you know, very news agency oriented, like, you know, kind of a very simple reporting. But soon as you have reporters, you know, on spot and, you know, being the eyes and the ears and using, you know, different, you know, means of technology, like, you know, videos and sounds and stuff, you know, doing like really immersive journalism, then things can, you know, go differently. But having said that, I think, you know, we have the problem, you know, emerging, like, which we need to cry out loud is the Gaza, for instance. There's no simple access to Gaza whatsoever. You know, it's impossible to have any sort of, like, you know, clear immersive information from inside. And if you get something, it's coming from social media, and then it's so easy to say that, yeah, well, you know, this is propaganda and so forth. And we have only numbers, and those numbers are quite cold. We know that 90% of the homes of the Palestinians in Gaza have been destroyed, but that's only a number. We don't feel it. We have a number that 17,000 children have been died. The Guardian newspaper did use the 17,000, but then they put it in a way that every single day since October 23, there's one class of children being killed. So that becomes more understandable and more immersive. But I think, you know, we are facing a tragedy, not only in Gaza, but many other places as well, that we don't have journalists like Joakim going, you know, to the place. And then those become kind of a cold, numberish, you know, not so interesting.
I also have to do a Finnish reflection, because I happened to be in government during this time period when Finland and Sweden tried to join NATO. And I think from the point of view of what Joakim said about not giving in to these demands, that one very odd thing was actually that NATO allowed the formation of this kind of triangle of negotiations between Turkey, Swedish and Finland, because that kind of situation in itself, of course, creates very good conditions for Turkey to put pressure on these individual states. So in my opinion, it was kind of unforgivable from the point of view of the alliance not to make it an issue for the whole organization and all the other member states, because in that kind of scenario you would not have Turkey pushing. But I'm also going to ask a question. Because I think, to me, it seems like there is a kind of a contradiction here, because for the foreign news to be interesting, you need to be on the ground, and at the same time you have a situation of press freedom that's worse than ever. And people need to read it, because we also need to learn about how authoritarian regimes work to be able to stop those developments from spreading elsewhere. So what would kind of be a proper kind of political strategy in this situation to strengthen press freedom, to kind of make the green area, as you said, bigger than it is at the moment? Like how should Finland act, or how should the EU act, or NATO? Like how do we make these questions more heavy on the political agenda when it comes such as to access of journalists in Gaza or to Hungary or Turkey?
Can I actually answer that? The story with Hungary is, of course, someone mentioned here how democratic countries can be held hostage by authoritarian regimes. And this is, of course, what Hungary is doing at the European Union since 15 years now. So there is a possibility to strip Hungary of its voting rights for violations of rule of law. And that has not been done. And this is a decision that lies with the heads of state. So this is not something that the European Parliament will decide, although they have voted numerous times to actually trigger this Article 7 and so on and so forth. This is not something that the Commission decides. This is something that the Council decides, which is composed from the heads of state. And why? Well, all the backroom talk that I'll ever heard in all sorts of places is that this is because of the economic interests that especially German industry has in Hungary with regards to automotive industry and so on and so forth. So when we're talking about what governments could do, I think we have to be very aware of, exactly with this kind of backroom negotiation and everything, that what are the political and economic structures within which politics happens, and not to look at things like press freedom and rule of law and democracy somehow separated from that. So I'm very much maybe it might not be very comfortable always to talk about those linkages, but if we actually want to use the kind of government leverage that we would have, it would be important to have these questions out in the open.
There's several things, that I feel very strong about. One thing is that societies that are still, based on the fact-based information and valuing it, as a part of open democracy. It's not about journalists themselves to protect, the press freedom. It's every one of us, So it's not about journalistic entities doing that, but it's everyone here. And that's why even myself, I'm not working as a journalist anymore. I feel very strong about to be vocal and trying to get this done, as in a large possible, way. Not really thinking that who needs to do that. Everyone needs to do that. That's one thing. Then there's other things that is very worrisome. According to the Press Freedom Index, in this year, there are 160 countries out of 180 countries, which means about 89% of all these listed countries that are having really hard hardships, economic hardships in order to make journalism. And so I think the financial situation of media entities is getting really grave, and I think we have to think about that we're not losing all these journalistic entities that are doing great job, because it's they're having hardship in paying the journalists to do what they need to do. And that's one thing. And so what are the politicians and the governments, what they need to do is thinking that there is some sort of sustainability, you know, also what comes to the editorial rooms in order for them to operate, also smaller ones, not only the big ones.
We had a little chat in the green room before this panel, and you guys made some very interesting points on self-censorship, and I'm a former journalist, and often the process is that the sort of kind of interests of the journalists kind of drive the news agenda. It's a very powerful at least component there. So if you would like to share your thoughts on how this has evolved into self-censorship and what that is and how that affects on the long run.
You can begin because you.
Yeah, I have some really nice juice stories from Hungary with this. So, in 2018, the government made a law that made production of information about migration a crime, punishable with 4 years in prison. So then, Central European University, which at the time was still in Budapest, we started having all these discussions with people that, so I'm teaching a class in migration, what am I going to do? So some professors would rename their course. Would you take that course? I was part of an activist group that had a blog where we would publish stories of violence on the Serbian-Hungarian border zone. Some of our activists themselves had refugee status, very precarious situations in terms of residence. So what do you do in that situation? And this is how self-censorship kicks in, that we all had a very different relationship with power, historically and legally, as in today. So you would have Hungarians who are, for instance, Jewish, who have horrible Holocaust stories in families, who have a very different relationship to the state, for instance. And then you would have someone like me with my beautiful Finnish passports and, you know, no fear in the world. So what it does is that it impedes the possibility of working together because we simply cannot find a common ground of safety, and it's a very real fear. So what happened to us in our activist group is that we had a meeting and we decided to shut down, and that's the end of my life as an activist, as a very conscious choice of self-censorship, which in this case was a very responsible one. And at the same time, in the same spring, it started in Hungary, all this like blacklist stuff, and the Finnish media was very interested in me and another Finnish person being there on some Orbán shit list, as you are if you are in Hungary. And in that thing, for instance, in Hungary, we all knew that we were not actually that much afraid, because we know how this regime operates, and when you're kind of in the eye of the storm, you see a bit more clearly. But what was interesting was that you would have like ex-husbands of my old colleagues who would come to me and say, oh, I don't want to be seen with you in public right now. And the self-censorship is not fundamentally about the self. It's like a cloud that it gets harder to see the further you get. And it's about the silencing of those kind of people that I'm afraid of with this kind of laws that introduce self-censorship goals.
I think you had a great line backstage, was it's not about what Joakim does, but what Joakim's aunt is worried about.
Yes, exactly. It was about Joakim's aunt in Sweden and whether Joakim's aunt in some small town in Sweden will say about the Kurdish question. So that's what I'm worried about, not about whether or not he will continue writing.
Self-censorship is one of the most dangerous, dangerous items, against the press freedom, because it's coming inside your head, and that's why it's very, very hard actually to manage, and because it's not visible, it's not very tangible, and so that's why the self-censorship is widely used, and the mechanisms are so various. There's like the slap cases are ideal to make journalists like self-censoring themselves. Slap means like strategic lawsuit against public participation. You can see it everywhere, even in the countries that are having high grades in the press freedom index. You can have politicians like filing charges against like journalists, and then the police needs to investigate those claims, and then in the social media it's already like these journalists are being indicted even though they are not like legally done so. So it's a kind of a nice political way of bashing journalists that are doing good job, killing journalists. In Gaza, there has been like 200 journalists being killed so far, almost more than 40 of them, like when they have been, doing their job. That's really like, where AFP needed to evacuate their Gazan journalists, because they thought that, okay, these guys are going to be killed, and soon afterwards, maybe a week later, then the journalists of Al Jazeera were killed in Gaza. So things really happen. So you'll get
also in Slovakia killed.
Yeah, Jan Kuciak as a prime example. In a country which is not in a war. So you have so many ways of doing it, and to be honest, like in a country like Finland or in Sweden, the social media is very powerful also to get inside journalists' head. While you have like tons of messages, trying to insult you as a person, that really affects, even though people would say it doesn't.
But because I also mentioned backstage that there's a conflict between, on the one hand, as a journalist, especially these days I'm employed as a journalist, but for years and years, many years, I've been a freelancer. Obviously, as a freelancer and a journalist in general, you want to show, when you wrote a really good piece about something, an article you worked really hard with, you want to show how you eventually managed to get some unique information, you managed to make a scoop, you managed to reveal something super interesting. You want to share this by using social media. But there's a conflict between wanting to do that, and on the other hand, if you do that, you might jeopardize your safety and your ability to work in an authoritarian-ruled country. So I've been writing for a dozen years a lot about Turkey, but I've been more and more, speaking of self-censorship, more and more avoiding sharing anything, even my own articles in social media, fearing that not what just happened to me would happen. My worst case scenario was that I will one day maybe be denied entry and deported and not be allowed to return for 5 to 10 years, like other foreign journalists. I did not take into account that I might be prosecuted and sentenced to prison. But this is also a kind of self-censorship that I've been avoiding sharing my own articles, fearing the consequences.
Should we have time for a couple of audience questions? I'll move here from past the lights.
I can also go around.
Okay, I should like to bring up a different example. The example is the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. A bit more than 2 years ago. Okay, since 2 years we have a report about the matter by Seymour Hersh, a very detailed report which also fits which observations that I could make here in Helsinki. Okay, my daily paper is Hufvudstadsbladet. Should we call it mainstream? In Hufvudstadsbladet, the matter was mentioned 3 times since. The Hersh report was mentioned 3 times since. The first 2 times by a journalist who mentioned it in a half sentence, in a formulation which indicated that the report was wrong. The third time, it was that one of these 2 journalists was jubilant that somebody had interviewed Hersh, and Hersh had said, either you believe me or you don't. Which, as a journalist, thought cringe-worthy, was very happy somehow that he could say something negative about Hersh. Okay, as I said, it is perfectly logical that it was the USA who blows up the pipelines. Very short before the event, we had in Helsinki harbor visiting an American ship of the American Navy, which was very obviously equipped with everything which one needs for such a thing, for such an enterprise. And of course, it fits also very well economically to the USA that somehow...
I'm sorry, but we need a question because there's other questions.
Anyway, fits very well economically for the USA that Russian gas is blocked and the USA can become the biggest exporter of liquid natural gas in the world. But okay, my mainstream paper doesn't report it.
Thank you.
Okay, good. And then I have the next one here.
Thanks very much for a really excellent presentation and discussion. Hearing about how sort of Swedish authorities and politicians were quite ready to sort of sell out, as it were, or compromise on these, liberal values that you would expect Sweden to represent, really got me thinking about how I feel in the past few years people have learnt to have increasingly low expectations of, politicians and the establishment in general, in terms of, in the sense that it feels kind of naive to expect that they would uphold some sort of moral or political principles in their decision making. And I think, the situation, the genocide in Gaza has created so many more opportunities for this kind of disappointment. And I feel like there's a real sort of growing, cynicism, which is probably pretty dangerous to civil society. So I'd like to ask, first of all, whether you sort of agree with that characterization or whether you feel I might be missing something, and then to reflect a bit on what you see as the sort of consequences of that going forward. Thank you.
And a question from here as well.
Thank you, Joakim, for excellent presentation. My question concerns another case, actually the case that was brought up by Caius, Gaza. There's this very famous in Sweden, this appeal with a lot of journalists requiring better coverage, better working conditions, raising questions about the quality of reporting from Gaza. I would like to hear your comments on this kind of strategy to somehow enhance the working conditions of Swedish and international journalists, how you see this kind of strategy working. Thank you.
And then I think the last one here.
Thank you so much. I have a question about how, I would like to hear you reflect about how the financing of journalism can also be a threat to journalism. And you were a little bit already talking about it when it comes to like what kind of articles are published and pushed and like distributed to people. When we as I am also a journalist and I work at a commercial paper, and we of course operate within this market economy thinking where we don't just think about, like we like to say that we only think about what do people need to read, what information should we like distribute to people, but we're also speaking a lot on what do people want to buy, what kind of information, what kind of articles are people interested in actually purchasing. And as a journalist, I feel this is quite an ethical dilemma often, because these are not necessarily the same things, like what people want to buy and what people would need to read in order to secure press freedom and democracy.
All right, that's free order.
So should I reply to all of these questions, or
pick your favorite one or ones?
Okay. Nord Stream. I mean, I don't see why it's impossible to report about this in either mainstream or more specialized media. I certainly have seen this mentioned, so I think it's necessary to look at more media outlets to see a wider picture, and I certainly try to do that myself as a foreign affairs reporter. Liberal values and the Swedish government. I suppose I would have to say that yes, I think the image in general of Sweden has been tarnished by what happened during the NATO process. I think I've certainly heard this by people with some sort of refugee diaspora background. That's the image that I have had of Sweden, that my parents, having arrived here as young refugees, have had of Sweden, or people in general in the world have had, that this has been tarnished, that this has been sort of a bastion of standing up for liberal values and etc. And when all of a sudden the current government, but also slightly the former social democratic one, really bent the knee for the Turkish will and proved this enormous willingness to somehow meet the demands. This was really hurting the image, and I think hurting the liberal values that certainly many of us being citizens of Sweden stand up for. And that we as journalists are also a part of defending, obviously. On the other hand, this is also what they announced from the very outset, the current government that we still have, that they would do. They said that we will finish the NATO business much faster than the former government had. They even claimed to not have any baggage by not having made any political statements or made any political promises or deals which went against Turkey's will in the past. So they were quite open with doing anything that it took, even though they did things secretly also, obviously. The third question with the 500 names, yes. Now it's actually more, and not only journalists, it's also been intellectuals and so on signing this statement, which basically says that we demand access to Gaza, as international journalists must have access to Gaza, and this is something that most media outlets and organizations in the world are fully agreeing on. The demand also said that the world must act against the killing of hundreds by now of Palestinian journalists. We're running low on numbers of remaining living journalists in the Gaza Strip. As well as, and this was the controversial part of this statement, that by publishing too much pro-Israeli content, basically, several media outlets have been enabling a genocide, not actively but passively enabling. So this statement and the list got a lot of attention, both good and bad attention. It resulted in some media outlets stopping all of the co-signers of this from reporting until at least the turn of the year about Gaza, which must be identified as a bad consequence, because the very same people who were the most engaged in Gaza are now stopped from reporting about it. And this is because their independence was questioned. And this is because the statement got some criticism because of this last additional piece about passively enabling a genocide being added at the end without the knowledge of some of the co-signers, sadly. While also generally the hard right and the far right have attacked this as a scandalous left woke, etc. Piece of example of how there is no more real journalism except for themselves. So this has been a real watershed when it comes to both the view on what journalism is or should be, and also increasing polarization in my country. So what do I think about it? So I think that generally this has been a good thing, because if somehow, and I'm sure that's the case, if somehow some people knew that it's Israel being they're the part preventing international journalists from getting access to Gaza. In most other armed conflicts in modern or present history, we, as professional journalists, have had access. We are simply denied that access now, and that is almost unheard of. Especially as this government claims to be democratic, doing it, keeping this practice. So I think it's good that we got this was highlighted. It's Israel preventing people like me from accessing Gaza. On the other hand, some people have claimed that this became, and we're really good at this in Sweden. When we try to make a debate about something, the debate becomes a debate. And then it's just the meta news eventually. And so some people have claimed that the fighting about this statement and the co-signers and the consequences have blocked some of the reporting about Gaza. And that certainly wasn't the intention, I think. But if that's true, that's a sad consequence, obviously.
Our main censor, our producer Eetu, is pointing at the clock, but we're going to still hear from Anastin and Kaius briefly.
Okay, so very quickly, I think coming to the aspect of reporting in places that are war zones, it's not about like whether you are from left or right or what's your political background or not. Like, you know, it's about neutral, fact-based journalism, and that should not be controversial from any point of view. And so, access to Gaza or access to any sort of like war zone in a way that creates an environment where reporting is good enough, you know, it's vital for every single one in the society, regardless of your political views or so. When I was reporting in Kosovo back in the days like 1999, you know, there was like 848,000 Albanians being deported like from their home areas to neighboring countries by the Serb forces within a time period of a couple months. So it was very quick and very violent, and there was no access for a serious access for journalists, you know, to cover what was happening inside the Kosovo. So this has happened before. But if someone would have told me in 1999 that, like, you know, 25 years later, when, you know, the world is so, you know, informatic and mediatic and so forth, this would happen in a much more graver way, I would not have believed. And here we are, and that's serious stuff, you know. And we should all be together with that, regardless if you are a right conservatist or a woke leftist, you know. And that's the press freedom is all about. It's all about us.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just finish very quickly. I'll pick the questions of whether or not politicians are morally incompetent and media and capitalism and try to answer those in one. So in Hungary, what I've observed in my work is how liberal knowledge institutions, media, university, all of that, NGOs become a minority. And the public sphere says that 2 + 2 is 5. You know that it's 4, but it still always says that. So that's the case in Hungary. And why has that happened? There's been a reversal of power in terms of politics. So it has been the regime that is doing that. And now what I'm worried about, as in like literally in the last couple of weeks in this country, is that I feel the same urgency in the liberal intelligentsia in here, that they are also becoming a minority towards their own elected politicians who are not, for instance, demanding access of journalism to Gaza and so on and so forth. But also things like that. I'm sure all the Finns in the audience have happily followed the case of the University of Helsinki kicking out a bookstore in their premises. And now I feel like the similar kind of effect where liberal knowledge institutions become a minority is also somehow happening in here, but not because of an authoritarian turn, but because of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Big thank you to Joakim for sharing your story and to Kaius and Anastina for an excellent discussion.